Well, stand anywhere in Wales and draw a circle of a few miles around you, and I will virtually guarantee you will find a wealth of heritage. And this is a perfect example. I'm standing here on top of St Mary's Hill near Bridgend. Up to the north we have the industrial or former industrial valleys of South Wales, and then down behind me to the south we have the Vale of Glamorgan looking down towards the coast. And within this circle of history there is so much to be found from the very earliest period right up until the present day. Our film today is truly a walk through time, and the centre of our circle is the little village, the small village of Treoes. And really the chronology of the village and its surrounding area, well, here they're almost a microcosm of the history of Wales. And sometimes we can see evidence in its physical form on the landscape. Sometimes that evidence is contained within memories and legends. And so much of that has been brought to life by the fabulous and painstaking work of the Treoes History Group. Underlying and underpinning all of our human history is, of course, geology. And where we've lived and how we've lived throughout the ages has been determined by these rocks and the soil beneath our feet. You know, these rocks look as if they may have dropped out of the sky. Perhaps that's not so much of an exaggeration, because I think they're what are called glacial erratics. That is, when the glaciers were melting some 10,000–12,000 years ago, they'd carried these rocks within them and then deposited them here on top of the hill. You know, this rich, gentle, undulating landscape has attracted settlement for many, many thousands of years. And what I find so fascinating is, although technology has changed, and my goodness is changing so rapidly, nevertheless, the needs of people who lived in areas like this, in the Iron Age for instance, are exactly the same as our needs today. We have to have somewhere to live, we need food to eat, something to drink, the support of a local community or family. All these elements are so important to enhance and make our short stay on this earth a little better. In 2012, an important collection of Bronze Age axes dated between 1800 BC was discovered near Colwinston. These tools or weapons, now in the National Museum of Wales, mark an important technological change. Walk along any street in our towns and villages, and we pass by gardens, walls and fences, often defining our sense of ownership and occupancy, and perhaps also giving us a little sense of security. Little different really from this Iron Age hill fort, Tan y Llan, below the church here at St Mary Hill. And here we have this enormous outer enclosure with its ditches and its banks where they kept the cattle, and then a smaller inner enclosure, their houses where they actually lived. This part of Wales was occupied by the Silures tribe, a people who the Romans described as fierce and warlike. And this place, on this hill, with its views out across the surrounding countryside, was a very important strategic location, because at least from here you might have advance warning of invaders coming in towards you. And what did those Romans do for us? Well, they established a settlement called Bovium, which we now know today as Cowbridge, a place of cows, and they also built an important line of communication, the A48, which is still used on a daily basis, the Via Julia Martina, an important form of communication, an important line of communication then and today. After the Romans left, we entered into a period, the so-called Dark Ages. I think they were actually anything but that. But it was a time that resonates with legend and folk tales. And what greater legend do we have than King Arthur? Now, there are so many places in Britain that have references to King Arthur, and here is no different. A couple of historians researched and came up with the theory that he was actually buried for a short while in a cave near Coedormustur before being exhumed and moved to a more permanent burial place. But here we have actual factual evidence. This example of early Christianity here at St. Cana's Church in Llangan, this wonderful 8th to 9th century cross which depicts the crucifixion. And there's so much detail in this. We can actually see on the right hand side there the spear being thrust into Jesus' side, and it's thought that this image on the left-hand side, where he's being offered a sponge soaked in vinegar. This kind of visual imagery at the time was all so very, very important because, of course, you were dealing with a largely illiterate society. If that cross isn't enough, there's another superb example of a Christian cross. This dates from the medieval period, and it really is absolutely brilliant. The detail on the carving is just terrific. In fact, it's considered to be one of the most important crosses of its type in the whole of Glamorgan. This is such a glorious place to be on a lovely autumn afternoon. And it's a deeply historic religious site as well. The church is dedicated to Saint Cana. Saint Cana, who was the sister-in-law of Saint Illtyd, of Llanilltyd Fawr, and the mother of Saint Crallo. Cana was a princess from Brittany who came and settled in what is now Cardiff. Hence we have place names like Pontcanna and Canton. There are clear indications, I think, that this place was an ancient clan. And we know there's a holy well dedicated to St. Cana in Carmarthenshire. And there's also the strong possibility that there was a holy well here, and we think it was probably down in the next field. So this very, very important early Christian site. The church dates from the 12th to 13th centuries, but it was really revamped and refurbished during the Victorian period. This place has been associated with some very, very important people. And one of the most significant was the preacher David Jones. He lived during the 18th century and he came to this church to preach. And at that time, Llangan was considered to be a pretty riotous place. But he came along, and such was his power of preaching that he converted many people, and he started to pull in congregations from dozens of miles around. On the first Sunday of every month, he would hold his services here, and so many people came that they filled the church, they filled the actual churchyard, and they also had to hold some meetings in nearby barns. He must have been an incredibly charismatic man to have drawn people in from such a wide area to what was, after all, a tiny, small, almost insignificant parish. With the coming of the Normans, My word, was this a hotly contested zone. And we can see how important it was to the Normans by the fact that they established castles in Bridgend, Ogma by Sea and Coity, these great permanent structures. But they also built much more less permanent structures, mottes as they were known. And this was a ditch and bank with a raised mound and then fortified with timber palings. This one here at St. Mary Hill, my goodness, it was attacked so many times by the neighbouring Welsh tribes that the Normans gave up on it and they said, we haven't had enough, and they actually sold it to the monks of Neath, the Cistercian monks of Neath Abbey, who then in turn established quite an important grange in this locality. For 500 years or more, until well within living memory, here at St. Mary Hill was the site of a very famous horse fair that attracted people from all over Britain and Ireland, coming here on the 26th of August. Such an important event for travellers and gypsy families. In the 19th century, there was a pub which was located close to the church, may even be on the site of that house behind me. But it was reckoned that they took enough money on fair day to support themselves for the rest of the year. There's a really delightful reminiscence on the Treoes History Hub website about the fair day. August the 26th brought back memories of Fair Mynydd. And what memories! The coming and going past one's door of all sorts of conditions, an endless stream of traffic, the merry and gay, the serious and grave, merchant and peddler, cattle drovers and showmen, traps, carts and gambos, the rough and the ready, all in good temper, setting out for the fair, and an incessant rumbling din. It seems hard to believe that this pleasant, quiet piece of open countryside was once the place of such wonderful activity. Shakespeare wrote, "What's in a name?" Well, as far as this place is concerned, a heck of a lot. Because when I came here and saw the place name, my first inclination was to pronounce it Treoes. But then the locals pronounce it Treoes. But if you go back to the medieval times, it's called Goston. Now, Goston, or Goss rather, refers to a marshy, waterlogged area. And it's interesting, there are other places in the locality with similar names. Waterton, for instance, and as it's now called, Penllyn, but of course it should be Penllyn, the head of the lake. Just by strolling around this village, or any village really, and looking over the walls, looking over the hedges, and there's so much history. History is really in abundance. And what I find fascinating is a place like this is made up of so many different types of houses. We have the houses of obviously the wealthy people, and then you have the houses of agricultural workers. Now I have a little theory, and I may be completely wrong because I haven't done any research whatsoever, but just looking at this little complex on my left hand side, here in the centre of the village, looks suspiciously, to me anyway, like an animal pound, but I'm more than happy to be proved wrong on that point. Happily, this village still has its pub, but there were once 4 here at one time, and a malt house. Right up until the 20th century, small villages like this were often largely self-sufficient, with their own blacksmith, carpenters, dressmakers, and so on. Since medieval times, an important person was the miller, and not far away are the scant but important remains of a local corn mill. Although this place was mainly rural, industry was not so far away. Many of the men from this village went to work in the expanding 19th century coal mines in the valleys, a short distance to the north. Well, now here's a surprise. In the middle of the rural vale of Glamorgan, up pops this strange structure in this field. This area really was the junction between rural and industrial Wales. And here we have evidence of industrialization, dating in this instance from the middle of the 19th century. It's the chimney stack and remains of an engine house from a lead mine here at Llangan. It's thought, of course, there are references to the Romans coming here to excavate lead, and an interesting fact is that there wasn't a single county in Wales that hasn't been exploited for lead at one time or other during its history. Perhaps one of the most profound events that affected the area was World War II and the opening of the massive Royal Ordnance Factory on some 900 acres of compulsory purchased land at Waterton. This was a staggering undertaking, and the reasons for the construction was because of the huge numbers of unemployed people in the locality, and over 40,000 were engaged there at its peak, and also the excellent railway and road connections to the major ports of Cardiff, Barry and Swansea. I find it staggering, but there were over 24 miles of railway tracks serving the complex. It was once the largest employee factory that ever existed in Britain. There was a local story that the reason the factory was never bombed was because mist and fog usually covered the site, making it impossible to detect. However, I have actually seen a Luftwaffe reconnaissance photograph that shows everything in very fine detail. The administrative offices are now the home to the South Wales Police Headquarters. And this is the reason why we've made this film. This is Saron Chapel on the outskirts of the village of Treoes. It's been serving the community since its establishment in 1830, and the actual building dates from 1841, and it's now Grade 2 listed. This is actually the burial place of one of the founders of the chapel, Lewis Jenkins. And what I find so fascinating is that it was ordinary workaday people who were behind the establishment of such places like this. Here's a great example, because Lewis was illiterate, but he signed the lease, the deeds of this chapel, just with a simple X. David Jones must have been an incredibly charismatic man, and doubtless he inspired other people to follow in his footsteps. One such was William Griffiths, a preacher who'd established a chapel in Llanharan. And he came here to help the local population establish their chapel here in Treoes. When he came, of course, this building didn't exist, and so they met in a local barn. And they did that for some 10 years until they raised £240 to build this wonderful structure. One of our most brilliant historians wrote about the times when people met during the upsurge in nonconformity, when they met in the barns, and he described them as the granaries of God. After William Griffiths' period of tenure, he was replaced by a young preacher, Rhys Saron Jones. And he wasn't called Saron after this chapel. He was called Saron because he was born in that place in Carmarthenshire. He was only here for about 3 years, but then he had a calling to Scranton in the United States to go and establish a chapel there. And he was just one of many, many preachers who went across the pond, as it were, and established the role of nonconformity in the United States. It's been estimated at the peak of nonconformity there were about 6,500 chapels in Wales, but of course, as time has gone on, many have been demolished, some have changed their uses, some have been abandoned. So it is with huge pleasure that we can stand here today and see a chapel which is still virile, active and living, and has been so lovingly and carefully restored. This is due 100% to a local group of people who had so much enthusiasm and drive to work together to preserve this chapel. I've been involved with the preservation of historic buildings all my working life, and I know only too well the amount of effort and energy and drive that it takes to preserve such buildings. So I really take my hat off to everybody who's been involved to ensure that this stands the test of time. An offshoot of the chapel preservation has been the emergence of a very active and enthusiastic group of local historians who've worked over the past 8 years or so finding out more about the history and heritage of their community. The work has resulted in the creation of the Treoes Heritage Hub, a website that documents the history of the locality from the earliest times to today. It's a superb piece of work, and I'm delighted to be able to find out firsthand how it happened from one of the founder members, Ruth.
I've been waiting here for you.
Hi Ruth, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you again too. How are you?
I'm on top form, thanks.
Good.
And I've had a wonderful couple of hours wandering around this village looking at the history. And I know you've been heavily involved in it.
Yes.
How do you get involved?
Well, I got involved initially to support the grant application for Solent Chapel restoration. We'd started a little supporters club in the vestry, as this used to be called then. It became obvious that we needed a little bit more support for the grant application. It so happened that the leader that had started it actually finished for personal reasons, and we were stuck a little bit as to how to keep the club together. So I came up with the idea of history. The ladies got very involved with the history and told us lots of things, you know, about the village. So I got a basics to start on. Then as I got into it a little bit deeper, I found David Howell. Now, I had never heard of David Howell. Nobody had ever mentioned him. I mentioned him to the ladies in the club, and no. They were insistent that really, apart from what they knew, Treoes had no history, none whatsoever. So I pursued David Howell.
What did you find out about him?
What I found out about him, what was special about him, that he actually achieved. He became Dean of St David's, but on his way, on his journey, he made a tremendous difference to the lives of others, particularly those in Cardiff. That impressed me so very much. He didn't have a good start. He lived with his grandmother in Tinakaya, and she was the one that sort of brought him to religion. At one point he went to live with his dad in Bridgend, and there he met a young lady. They fell in love. Unfortunately, he was not a very good little boy, or young man I should say, and he got her into trouble, as the saying goes. They married. About 5 months later, the young son, Taliesin, was born. And I think it's because of that misdemeanour in his youth that he didn't achieve anything greater than the Dean of St David's. He could have. He was a worthy man.
Just absolutely amazing. Do you know, one of the things I've learned since doing this filming is that there's so much history on our doorstep here in Treoes, and so many amazing and fascinating characters who've been involved in the village. So many, many congratulations to you and everybody involved with what you've done with the History Hub. It's absolutely terrific.
Thank you, Richard.
Goodness, the weather's changed, and another thing that's changed is my understanding and appreciation of the history of this tiny part of the world. I had no idea there was such a complex and involved story to be told, but the work that the community have done in preserving the chapel, in converting the former vestry into the History Hub, and really enabling us to get a much better understanding of the life and times of the community of this place, well, it's been quite an eye-opener for me. So, weather notwithstanding, I'm going off to explore a little bit more about this fascinating part of the world.